All right, so здравствуйте еще раз, коллеги. My name is Olga Mesropova, and I am a professor of Russian at Iowa State University, where I've spent the past couple decades developing advanced level Russian language and culture courses. And today I will discuss perhaps an unconventional yet highly effective pedagogical tool, stand-up comedy. And I will look at how Russian stand-up humor, both Soviet and contemporary, can serve as a dynamic resource for promoting linguistic proficiency, while also helping our students critically engage with major themes in Russian society, history, and culture. So my work in the area of stand-up comedy actually began a good 20 years ago with research on Soviet estrada monologues, which are carefully crafted satirical pieces by performers such as Mikhail Zhvanetsky, Mikhail Zadornov, Semyon Altov, and others. Over time, my interest expanded to include the more autobiographical and much more immediate voices of contemporary stand-up comics, including Slava Komisarenko, Ivan Abramov, and Yulia Akhmedova. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with those folks. You will be in just a little bit. So despite differences in style and historical context, all these performers share a common ability. They use humor not merely to entertain, but to critique social norms, challenge authority, and reflect on their own lived experiences. It is what one scholar has termed as seriously funny social criticism that, when applied to a language classroom, offers rich opportunities to cultivate advanced language skills, sharpen critical thinking, and foster nuanced intercultural literacy. Before turning to specific examples of classroom applications, I would like to briefly outline the key distinctions between Soviet estrada and Russian stand-up, or more contemporary Russian stand-up. So in the Soviet Union, humor was the realm of the so-called satiric humorist, or the so-called estrada comedy. It was a sanctioned performer delivering pre-scripted monologues on official variety programs. Their performances, as Seth Graham notes, were often read from scripts at a lectern even, creating an illusion of literary satire. Performers like Mikhail Zhvanetsky and Mikhail Zadornov navigated censorship, of course, with wit, relying on allegory and Aesopian language. Central to this strategy was the notion of the so-called sgovor, a kind of implicit pact between performer and audience. The comedian hinted rather than directly stating something, and the audience, equipped with shared cultural knowledge, understood. It was a co-construction of meaning that relied on careful interpretation and a sophisticated grasp of cultural codes. Now, today's comedians who refer to themselves as stand-upers have left behind the lectern for a microphone and a much more direct, often improvisational relationship with their audience. And frankly, if you look at the photographs I showed above, of course, all the Soviet comedians are reading from a script, quite literally, right? And I remember in one of the interviews, Zadornov was asked, "Why do you always hold paper in your hands?" And he says, "Because I don't know what to do with them." So with the hands. So that was kind of a very, again, tongue-in-cheek excuse. But basically, Soviet comedy is much more literary satire, which I think lends itself much more for reading comprehension and basically used as not just listening, but also as written text, whereas contemporary comedy is much, much more improvisational. So just a few examples or a few comparisons between the two. To give you a sense, right, that I talked about. So stand-upers, again, a much more it's a much younger generation, right, of comics, and they embrace a style that aligns more closely with what we in this country and in the West are probably used to, so aligns more closely with Western tradition of stand-up. It's confessional, it's immediate, and deeply personal. Slava Komisarenko, for instance, recounts being pursued by the Belarusian KGB, not through euphemism or parody, but with the tone that blends irony and vulnerability. Yulia Akhmedova draws humor from the everyday challenges of body image, dating, and gender roles, using her own life as a lens for cultural critique. This new comedy thrives on tension between state and individual, between personal experience and public expectation, offering a far more unfiltered form of social commentary than the Soviet-era predecessors could ever risk. Let's turn to classroom application right away. And I've used both Soviet and Estrada contemporary, or Soviet Estrada and contemporary stand-up texts for students who have completed at least 4 semesters of Russian coursework. I have used some of these materials in my 300-level courses, such as Russia Today, as well as independent study offerings delivered both online and in face-to-face contexts in both L2 and mixed L2 heritage learner classrooms. Rather than serving as standalone instructional materials, the monologues usually supplement broader socio-political discussions, function as warm-up activities, or are assigned as targeted homework, particularly in online learning contexts. I have also integrated translated versions of some of these routines into my English language course, Contemporary Russian Culture from Gorbachev to Putin, where students typically have actually no prior knowledge of Russian at all, and we're dealing exclusively with translated texts. All right, so let's look at a Soviet comedy text. And I think one of the more effective texts to apply to both a language classroom and a classroom taught in translation is Mikhail Zhvanetsky, 1966, a really deep Soviet stagnation era monologue called Deficit, or shortage. Some of you might have heard this monologue also performed by Arkady Rifkin, although in some YouTube videos, Zhvanetsky reads it himself. So the monologue is a series of humorous vignettes where Zhvanetsky satirizes late Soviet life, showing how social status and relationship were shaped by the ability to obtain scarce goods, shoes, delicacies, anything rare. The punchline captures the irony. If everything was suddenly available, life would lose its meaning and texture. Beneath the humor, the monologue exposes the absurd logic of a command economy where shortages sustain informal hierarchies and social privilege. A key subtext is an implicit sgovor with the audience. Scarcity gave Soviet life its structure and purpose. Through this layered humor, Zhvanetsky reinforces the emotional complexity of living in a system defined as much by absence as by presence. So monologue I have on the screen, you bought them, I bought them. And it's interesting, he doesn't actually mention what them are. There's one reference to shoes. So you bought them, I bought them, the guy you don't like, he bought them too, everyone bought them. And now we're all walking around gloomy, pale, and yawning. The warehouse manager walks by, we don't even notice him. The store director, we scoff at him. The inventory clerk in the shoe department, just some regular engineer. Is that good? No, it's disgusting. Let there be abundance, let there be everything, but let there still be something missing. Да, пусть будет изобилие, пусть будет все, но пусть чего-то не хватает. So I typically introduce this monologue at the end of a two-class sequence focused on the stagnation era when shortages, informal economies, and personal connections defined everyday Soviet life. Before reading the monologue or listening to it, whatever is appropriate for the class, students work through a handout that offers an overview of the period and explains key cultural concepts such as chronic shortages, long queues, and the informal mechanism of acquiring goods. This cultural scaffolding enables students to better grasp the humor, irony, and social critique in Zhvanetsky's text. Some of the targeted pre- and post-reading or, again, listening activities I use when my class works on deficit include vocabulary and context priming, cloze exercises, and a range, I'm just showing a little excerpt of open-ended questions to guide students through a close reading of the monologue and its immediate cultural context, as well as a set of various writing prompts. So let's move on to more contemporary material from here, and turning to this comedy that we can watch today. Russian stand-up comedy contemporary stand-up comedy presents a distinct set of pedagogical challenges and opportunities as well. Unlike Soviet-era estrada, today's stand-up is a relatively young genre in Russia, achieving widespread popularity only in the late 2010s. For example, in 2015, my hometown of St. Petersburg, home to nearly, over 5 million people, had only 30 professional stand-up comics. By 2021, that number had grown to tenfold, accompanied by a rapid expansion of performance venues. And of course, following Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, the stand-up scene shifted again. Many comedians relocated abroad, continuing their work in exile, while others in Russia ceased performing or resorted to significant self-censorship. Given the genre's youth and volatility, there's little scholarly research on Russian stand-up, particularly, absolutely, on its classroom application. Yet its popularity with Russian audiences and its accessibility on platforms like YouTube, TikTok, and Facebook make it an invaluable classroom resource. Stand-up routines appear in a range of formats from full-length concerts to 5 to 7 minute discrete monologues and the increasingly popular YouTube shorts, which typically run under 2 minutes. I personally particularly favor shorts for their compactness and narrative density. They offer rich grammatical and syntactic models while drawing students into broader sociocultural conversations. Many address universal themes readily accessible to learners, while others require more targeted scaffolding to support linguistic and cultural comprehension. Shorts can be integrated into a classroom in several ways, depending on the instructor's creativity, obviously. One effective method is to use them as brief 10-minute warm-up activities focused on the routine featuring accessible language and universal themes. After 1 or 2 quick previewing activities, students listen or watch once or twice. For the second viewing, depending on the difficulty level of the routine, a closed worksheet may be provided to support comprehension. Students then respond to targeted questions, either orally or in writing as homework. Another successful approach I like is the jigsaw format. Students are divided into small groups, each assigned a different short for guided analysis. After identifying key vocabulary, summarizing the main idea, and preparing short presentations, students reassemble into new groups to share and discuss the different monologues. And this structure obviously promotes much more intensive listening, especially because students can slow down or speed the monologue, critical interpretation, collaborative learning, and broader exposure to a range of humor styles and cultural themes. So one particular accessible and effective example is Yulia Akhmedova's little clip «Квартира для кролика» that I will play right now. Hopefully it works.
Я как настоящая сильная независимая завела себе домашнее животное, но это не кот, прошу заметить, нет, это кролик. Кролика зовут Зая. Короче, я купила его за 1000 рублей в зоомагазине, сразу отвезла к ветеринару, и он мне сказал, что, говорит, вы поймите, кролик очень подвижное, свободолюбивое животное, поэтому было бы неплохо выделить для него отдельную комнату. Я говорю, я постараюсь, но сложновато выделить отдельную комнату в однокомнатной квартире. Она такая, так, подождите, а лоджия или балкон у вас есть? Я говорю, нет. Она говорит, извините, это была спонтанная покупка. Я говорю, сейчас про кролика или про квартиру, да? Просто это странно осознавать, что живешь в квартире, которая недостаточно хороша даже для кролика, да?
Okay, so in just a few lines here, of course, Akhmedova skewers the absurdity of housing insecurity, young people's independence, right? She begins with «Я сильная, настоящая сильная независимая», да? Humorously recounts her decision to adopt a pet rabbit, only to be told by a veterinarian that such a free-spirited creature needs a room of its own. The irony, of course, is that Akhmedova itself lives in a one-room apartment. Linguistically, as you can tell, the sketch is rich in everyday colloquial Russian and really simple language, very easily recognizable for students with 5-semester or 4-semester language study. So this really is an ideal text for classroom use. Unlike Zhvanetsky's deficit that we just talked about, Akhmedova's monologue requires little prep work and opens up opportunities for discussion about contemporary urban life, housing situation, and ways young people choose to show their independence. Here's just a little snippet of comprehension check and open-ended reflection questions that could be used with this sketch. I should also say that in addition to brief warm-up activities, these type shorts can be used in full 50-minute class sessions structured around 3 to 5 select comedy clips. Students begin with pre-listening activities such as cultural context building, key vocabulary priming, prediction exercises based on the themes or titles of the clip. After viewing, then they engage in a range of open-ended post-listening tasks, group discussions, summarizing exercises, and critical reflection prompts. So one performer that I find very fitting for a 50-minute class type session is Slava Komisarenko, a Belarusian comedian who rose to fame before becoming a dissident voice during the 2020s protests against Alexander Lukashenko. He was then forced into exile after censorship in Belarus, so he moved to Russia, and then in Russia he again faced a persecution, and so he basically currently is continuing his career abroad. So providing students with Komisarenko's background and his encounters with Russian and Belarusian KGBs, typically through a brief handout and selected excerpts from his 2021 interview with Yuri Dudz, deepens, of course, student appreciation of the risks comedians face in contemporary world, and the cultural critique embedded in their performance. Now, Komisarenko's YouTube channel is expansive and offers a rich selection of full-length concerts and improvised audience interactions, making it an excellent resource for language instruction. Now, I very much like his improvised dialogues with audience members because they model natural speech patterns, very spontaneous humor and wit, and culturally resonant references. Let's watch this little clip quickly.
Да вот там. Как вас зовут?
Абдулла.
Абдулла. Я вас знаю, вы уже были, да, Абдулла?
Я вернулся, папа.
Вы вернулись. Пожалуйста, Абдулла, ваш вопрос.
Со мной. Я хотел спросить следующее. Если Лукашенко в какой-нибудь из следующих выступлений скажет, я объявляю славу своим преемникам, что ты будешь делать?
Вообще, можете себе представить цепочку событий, которая может к этому привести? Просто чтобы он такой... Так похоже, пародирует. Вообще, это ж реально я слышал, думал, может, что-то я так говорил. Коля, ты слышал? Вообще прикольно, один в один, жесть. Мы же его ловим, чтобы наградить. Ездим за ним везде. Такой скромняга, везде ускользает. Такой скромный, чистый белорус, конечно.
All right. Well, these routines, as you can tell, are funny and very popular. His quick wit transforms politically charged questions very commonly into these surreal and absurd fantasies, right? And of course, he continues this fantasy here, joking that authorities are not really chasing him right out of political persecution, but to reward him for his brilliant impersonation of Lukashenko. Koля there, of course, is Lukashenko's son, right? If anyone was missing that reference. So pedagogically, this clip allows students to explore parody, political satire, irony, and humor as a form of resistance. It also offers an authentic model of conversational Russian with accessible vocabulary, natural intonation, and real-time rhetorical strategies, making it an ideal springboard for discussion, vocabulary work, and again, broader classroom activities grounded in real-time political events. All right, and before wrapping up, I'll just give a few practical tips for those who are actually thinking of using stand-up comedy. What I definitely noticed is it's extremely important to always download and archive these clips through a range of tools on YouTube, like the 4K video downloader. These clips are posted by individuals. They can be taken down. The YouTube takes them down oftentimes for political references, so keep that in mind. Definitely listen through the monologue. That's what I noticed very importantly, because a lot of these monologues at a very R-rated level. So keep in mind the maturity level, the institutional guidelines, etc. And I think that's kind of the big prep work with these monologues. Listen to them in advance, right? Kind of see what the comedian is risking to say. Right. And to conclude, Russian stand-up comedy, past and present, opens up a world of pedagogical possibilities. It is performative, political, and personal. It invites students into the emotional and cultural rhythms of Russian life. As educators, it provides a powerful tool for advancing linguistic proficiency, fostering cultural literacy, and encouraging critical engagement, all while keeping our classrooms lively, dynamic, and seriously funny. Спасибо. I will stop sharing my screen right here. And our next presenter is Professor Benjamin Rifkin, whose paper is titled Changing the Paradigm, Teaching...
Things. There we go.
Спасибо огромное.
Меня просто выкинуло, я вернулась. Все нормально, мы записываем.
Мы очень рады, что ты вернулась. I just want to say, Olga, after your fabulous talk, it makes me even happier that my co-author and I, Anna Alsuhyeva, working on second edition of Advanced Russian Through History, in our new edition, we will have jokes for each chapter.
I think it's so especially for stagnation, because that's such a period of anecdote, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, some eras were easier to find jokes than others. I'll just leave it there, okay?
That's true. I think we'll keep the questions until the very end, Liana.
Oh, yeah. So I'm going to get my PowerPoint up. Can you all see it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I just want to say that I am my talk has references, and at some point when I'm done, I will upload into the chat, if I can do that, a one-page PDF with all the references, so you'll have them. I want to acknowledge that my presentation today is based on research that I've been doing with another co-author who's not a Russianist. Her name is Manuela Wagner. She's a professor of German and applied linguistics at the University of Connecticut. And she and I are writing a book called Compassion in the World Language Curriculum that will be published by ACTFL next year. So a lot of the work that I'm sharing with you today is work that we've done together. So just sort of background, people are wondering why bother studying a language? And you can see some of the bullets on the screen here. I don't need to read them to you about some of the reasons why people are not enrolling in our curricula, or they're fulfilling a foreign language requirement and leaving us pretty quickly. For another project, I've just been examining our curricula across the country. What does a Russian major look like in our institutions? And really, the design of most of our undergraduate programs are mismatched with what students are looking for and what they want. And many of our programs really are designed to prepare our students to go into doctoral programs in Slavic. And as we know, there are not a lot of jobs, and not a lot of our students are actually interested in that as a path to the future. Some more details about the Russian language major, and this is definitely not the case everywhere, but it's the case in a lot of places, and it's very similar to the design of majors not only in the other languages but in the humanities more generally. And what we're seeing is a very much a notion of coverage, that you have to cover certain topics in the curriculum, and the courses match those topics. And this is a reflection of the fact that our educational system was designed and is functioning now as a methods of transmitting knowledge, not skills. And of course, the issue of transmitting knowledge is much less salient in an era in which we're all walking around with little computers in our pockets and our purses that are more powerful than the computers that were on the spacecrafts going to the moon. So if we were to re-envision designing our curricula focusing on the transferable skills, then we might see something along the lines on the right of things that we might want our students to be able to do, and have courses designed to achieve those goals, with the content being related to Russian language, literature, and culture more broadly. And it's in this particular area, I don't know if you can see my cursor, of intercultural understanding, that I'll be focusing my remarks about compassion. And if we think about those skills and a toolbox we could be giving our students, we can teach them to use their knowledge of Russian to develop critical thinking and information literacy, to develop collaboration skills, to develop human judgment skills. And this means that we need to think about how we design our language classes and the place of English in those classes, especially at the lower levels. We need to think about why students should study Russian, and have answers that are not only related to getting a PhD. And we need to think about, what students can accomplish in the context of a Russian major. And here I'll just remind everybody of the work not only I've done, but others, about what are possible outcomes of a bachelor's degree in Russian for students who are not heritage learners, who don't previously speak a related language such as Ukrainian, who don't spend a semester or longer abroad or a summer at a place like Middlebury. What can they get done? What can they accomplish with their language? And it's very limited. So here I just want to talk about some definitions for empathy, compassion, and intercultural competence, and intercultural or global citizenship. These terms are used a lot, and I think it's really important for us to understand what they mean and how they're different. And Strauss and colleagues have identified compassion as having 5 elements: recognizing suffering, and I'll add to that, or unmet needs, understanding the universality of human suffering, having feeling or empathy for a person who's suffering, tolerating the discomfort of those feelings, and then being motivated to act to either meet those needs or alleviate suffering. And action is really important here. And so, I'm going to define compassion as something that comes about when you combine empathy with action, and intercultural citizenship as what happens when you combine intercultural competence and action. And then just connecting to some other theoretical frameworks, as I've mentioned in other contexts, L.D. Fink has a theory of significant learning, which emphasizes the human dimension. Catherine Denial's book last year for me was just utterly transformative, Pedagogy of Kindness, thinking about kindness as an important framework for how we decide what to teach, how we interact with our students, which is very important. Byram is the key author on intercultural citizenship, and it's also something that's important, of course, in our in our world readiness standards from the National Standards Collaborative. And rather than talking about intercultural competence, I think it's more productive for us to talk about intercultural humility. And you've got a couple of authors there, and again, you'll have the references. And here, I just want to emphasize the idea that I think it's important for us to provide our students with opportunities to observe and think and reflect that are receptive in their natures, and then opportunities to act, and then that would be productive. And I'm using those terms in the context that we're familiar with in terms of the receptive skills and the productive skills. So in Fink's taxonomy of significant learning, he emphasizes the importance of the human dimension and caring. And just anecdotally, in terms of my own experience of working with students on projects that bring them into the community and engage them with others, I find that that human dimension and that caring experience actually is transformative in how they view the world and how they view their learning experience and what they take away from it later. This kind of approach is very significant when we think about the global goals for sustainable development, because we can connect our students to these goals in terms of how we're studying Russian, what we're studying when we study Russian, what is the impact for them, and what can they do about it. And then just, some ideas about activities for the Russian language classroom um, that are possible in different kinds of levels, different kinds of communities. And you have this bulleted list here, and I'll give you some more examples in just a moment. But the work that I've done with these kinds of experiences has just been phenomenal in terms of student response. And I apologize, there's one more bullet that I would add to the list, which is collaborative online interactive learning, in which students are paired with a peer at another institution. Now, when the last time that I did that kind of a project, collaborative online international learning, or COIL, myself in a Russian culture class, I was actually able to work with colleagues in Moscow at International University in Moscow. And I wouldn't be able to do that right now, of course, but there are opportunities to have that kind of experiential experience for our students in collaboration with other Russophone institutions in the countries where, for instance, we currently send our students on study abroad throughout, including, of course, through ACTR. And I think it's really important that when we talk about injecting our curricula with projects that focus on compassion, that we create experiences for our students iteratively to reflect and to get feedback and to present. This is a way for us to emphasize the value and importance of what it is we're doing. And what I'm going to do now is share with you a few different possible activities that you can do at different proficiency levels that would have a component of bringing compassion to the classroom. So even at the novice level, we can have students think about the kinds of compliments that they can give one another, both in the Russian classroom and outside the Russian classroom. And this is an idea that was shared with my colleague and I by a professor at UW La Crosse who teaches French. And we were just so struck by it as a wonderful way to engage students in thinking about compassion, even when their language skills are very limited. So although the grammatical challenges in Russian are certainly greater than they are in French, it is definitely possible for us to practice giving and receiving compliments. And now I'm just so delighted to be able to sort of think back to just what was happening 45 minutes ago in Karen Evans-Romain's presentation on civil discourse. This is a terrific thing that we can do at the novice level, and it actually can really change the atmosphere not only of a classroom community, but of a school or college community. And I think it's really important for our students, and you're going to see the same box with these yellow words on the next several slides, for them to recognize a situation in which compassion would be helpful or appropriate, for them to reflect on what they could do to inject compassion into the interactions or the scenario, what actions they can take, and then take those actions, reflect on those actions, and then publicly present. And that public presentation can be within the classroom or outside the classroom. And at the lower levels, it can be in English. And I just want to go back to something I said earlier about what our students can accomplish in 4 years of studying Russian. If we were to spend 20 minutes a week in English on such tasks, there would be no impact whatsoever on the final outcome of our proficiency levels of our students. Except that we might find more students staying with the curriculum. And so if they stay longer, then they'll have higher outcomes than if they leave us after second year. But for those students who would have stayed, they'll still wind up at intermediate mid or intermediate high at the end of 4 years in a good program. So that's novice level, giving a compliment. At the intermediate level, we can ask students to read and discuss and reflect on Akhmatova's poem Lotova Zhena. Just a shout out to Jane Sheffelton, who I think is in the room, who has been with me on my Lotova Zhena journey about how many different ways can I use this one poem in all the classes I teach. I think one of the ways that this poem speaks to me in the current situation is that it does present, for those of you who aren't familiar, the importance of historical rupture and how one can be thrust into a situation where one can't look back. And here, of course, and just in terms of the current situation, in our communities, we have people who are refugees from the war against Ukraine. And we also have people who are refugees from natural disasters and climate crises. And so they don't have to be Russian speakers for us to think about how they have been thrust into a situation of before and after. They can't look back. And for our students to be able to think about what they can do to help people in this situation, whether it's in the community or elsewhere. And this brings me to a sidebar to talking about compassion and philanthropy. So students can, read about the war in Ukraine and decide that they want to raise money for Ukrainian refugees in Europe or in the United States, or that they want to raise money for other people who are caught in a difficult situation, whether it's a natural disaster or war. And they can also get involved in philanthropic activities where they're doing things for the community, that could be going to a food bank where there are refugees who rely on that food bank. And then at the higher level, and I did a project on this, and Tom Garza was kind enough to be an external reviewer on this project. Oral history interviews are just absolutely fabulous opportunities for students to connect their study of Russian with the real life experiences of Russian speakers in our communities. And one of the things that's really unfortunate about being a Russian speaker is that by definition, if you're a Russian speaker, you have been a witness to traumatic history one way or another, in a way that, if you happen to be Norwegian, your lucky break, not so much. And so having conversations with Russian speakers about their lives, their traumas, their experiences, the ways in which they have been witness to history, their parents, their grandparents, the stories. Great opportunities for our students to understand what it means to be in a culture, to live in a culture, to be part of a culture to which history arrives, and that's never a good thing. And once again, to have our students recognize the issues, reflect on them, think about what actions they can take those actions, reflect on them, and then give a public presentation, whether in Russian at this higher level, perhaps in the classroom or to the community or at a community center, or in English for the larger university community. And I think it's really important for us to consider how we are assessing our students' performance on these tasks. If we don't count it, they won't value it. And so we can look at the Intercultural Knowledge and Competence rubric from AAC&U, the value rubrics. And for those of you who are not familiar with the value rubrics, value is an acronym, which is why it's in all caps. And it stands for the Valid Assessment of Learning in Undergraduate Education. The value rubrics are available free for download. You just have to register by giving your name and email address. They want to know who you are and to be able to account for how many people around the country are using them. But once you give your email address, you will get email from them and then you can unsubscribe. So the value rubrics can be downloaded one at a time or all 16 at once. You can adapt them. They've been created by scholars from diverse institutions, diverse disciplines, and they're just absolutely fabulous. And you can adapt them. But I think one of the things that it helps us do is it helps us think outside the box of the A to F grading scale that so many of us are contractually bound to because our institutions use them. And I just want to pipe up and say that there's wonderful research being done about ungrading in our field. Yevgeny Dingub has been a very prominent speaker about moving away from grading or taking up ungrading. And Susan D. Bloom is a terrific author to consider on ungrading. And ways for us to think about assessing student work in differently from the way that we've been trained, I think is very important for us to consider. And here, and this is something I just keep saying again and again and again, we have to count what we value because we're only valuing what we count. And the students know that. So we have to count what we value. And if we say we value ethical reasoning and compassion and teamwork, then we have to have a way of communicating to our students that these are things that we value and it matters for your grade as long as we have grades. And then, as I've mentioned before in other contexts, I really think that we in our profession need to think more deeply about what it is that we're doing as educators. We need to think about what I think are our noblest purpose or our noblest purposes. And James Lang wrote an essay in the Chronicle that I think is absolutely fabulous about what our students will remember from our class 20 years ago. And here I just want to share a little personal story. In the summer of 1980, I was a student at Middlebury College's School of Russian in second year Russian. And I knew already at that point in my life that I wanted to be a professor of Russian. And my goal in that class and every Russian class that I was taking was not merely to get an A. My goal in that class and every Russian language class I took was to develop my Russian skills so well that I could pass for being Russian. That was my goal. And that motivation set me apart from pretty much everybody else in my class and all the students I've had since. However, I want to tell you one thing that happened that summer. As part of our program, our curriculum that summer, we learned about, I don't know, 10 or so words they're neuter nouns that end in mya, like imя время, and how they operate with an archaic grammatical reflex in the oblique cases. And I memorized all those words. And of course, one of them is the word vymya. Now, I just want to point out to you that I myself grew up on the 11th floor and have rarely spent any time with cows, even though 15 years in America's dairy land of Wisconsin. And over winter break, my wife and I spent some time in the Caribbean, and I was reading a Russian novel there called Deti Nashi, a Volga Tale, which has a very agricultural setting, and it's a very depressing novel. And I had spoken with my wife a little bit about the novel, and I'd said to her that it was depressing. And then we're sitting on our balcony in our hotel room reading, and I start to chuckle. And she says, "Why are you laughing? You're reading a depressing novel." And I said to her, "I have just encountered the word vymya for the first time in the wild in 45 years." So what I want to say about vymya is that I loved having that as part of my curriculum in 1980, but maybe it wasn't the most important thing for me to have. And maybe we can think about what we choose to emphasize in our classes so that our students will have lots to remember from them 20 years from now. At the same time, when I talk about teaching, the importance of teaching compassion, we have to model it. We have to model it as faculty. So when our students tell us things like, "My great aunt died," to not say, "Well, how does that have an impact on your class?" when a student says, I need to go to a funeral of somebody, to not question that student and just say, of course, and I'm so sorry. So we need to model compassion in how we interact with our students in order to have standing to talk with them about compassion when we're reading a short story or we're talking about the problems of immigrants in our own society. And that leads me to a question that I like to ask all of our faculty, and all teachers, about the question of rigor and rigidity, because I think a lot of people are confusing rigidity for rigor. And we need to think about what's most important for what our students are learning and how we evaluate that learning in the classroom. And maybe sometimes having a grammatical mistake is not the most important thing for us to be focused on. In this regard, as I've said in other contexts, I really want for us as teachers of Russian at the high school and college level to think about how we can make our courses not transactional, but transformational. And I think that having compassion as a significant component of our curriculum is a way to do that. And so with that, I thank you for your attention and your time, and we'll have questions later. So thank you. And I will put my references into the chat.
Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you for this very powerful presentation. All right, our next speaker is Professor Tom Garza from the University of Texas at Austin. And the title of his presentation is Russian-Mexican Connections, Creating Spaces for Intersectional and Intercultural Inquiry.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Let me just set this up here, see if I can do this. I hope if everyone can see the slides and not see all of my notation and everything, I hope. And if you see my notations, great. We're going to call it a closed caption presentation.
We do see your notations.
Well, should I do it? Should I just do it through screens? Let me just do it. How about that?
Yeah.
Is that better?
You stopped sharing altogether now.
Okay, let me do that one more time. My bad. I'm having traumatic flashbacks to COVID here. Sorry about that. Go back to PowerPoint. There we go. Is that better? I mean, I know my notes are still at the bottom. As I said, like captions, is that more visible to everyone? Thank you, Adina. Thank you. I see. Good. Perfect. Well, thank you all so much, and I'm so glad to be a part, even play a small part in this auspicious occasion of the 50th anniversary of ACTR, of which I have had an association, sometimes a rather intimate association with for the last 48 of those 50 years. This topic is one that is very personal to me, and it, I think, follows so nicely between Olga's wonderful invocations of humor and getting at things that our students can relate to, associate with, and then speak to from a personal perspective, to Ben's just simply wonderfully brilliant insight into compassion and how it relates to empathy and empathetic instruction. And indeed, I love the fact that in your invocation of Vimya, Ben, you managed to then pull back to Olga's presentation on injecting humor into everything. So thank you for that as well. This talk is really looking at a couple of courses as not models, but rather exemplars, just simply efforts, I'll call them, into trying to address not only the intersectional, intercultural inquiry that I hope a number of us, if not all of us, are engaged in, but also as a way to talk about the assault, the current unprecedented assault here in the state of Texas. It's been going on for more than 2 years now, and in the U.S. more generally since January. The unprecedented assault on the nurturing and protection that we've been able to give individuals and their identities in education and what we so frequently have called our safe spaces, the classroom. Through the elimination of DEI policies and program in all of our schools and universities now nationally, the need now is greater than ever to support these learners, their perspectives, bringing those perspectives to our classroom, and their positionalities now more than ever. So I'd like to kind of invoke here a little bit, a throwback to the 1970s and the wonderful work of Kostomarov and his Русский язык для всех program that I think most of us, of my generation at least, certainly had copies of, and everyone sort of in the ether from Middlebury to programs that around us, especially on the East Coast, were using that text, but also make a bit of adjustment now in the 21st century of that idea of programs of Russian for everyone, as in we'll put it into every language that everyone understands, literally, the instruction, but rather separate everyone into everyone or everybody to make it even a bit more visceral, how to create inclusive spaces in our Russian studies program. And at the same time, I might add, to help build our programs, to help generate, I think, more local both inclusion, but also enthusiasm for the subject matter that we're talking about. So let me take us back to the University of Texas at Austin. I say it half with pride and half with sheer disbelief that finally, in 2020, the University of Texas at Austin was designated a Hispanic serving institution, meaning that 25% or more of its student population is of, and using their term here because I'm not happy with it, Hispanic ethnicity. In the state of Texas, of course, it's primarily Mexican in origin, that population. And indeed, that same year in 2020, something our Governor Greg Abbott has yet to acknowledge in any public sphere, the state of Texas also became majority Hispanic, that is Mexican American, for the first time since it becoming part of the Republic, part of the United States, having been the Republic of Texas. And so now, with more than 25% of our student population identifying as Latinx or Latina, it is more important now, I think more than ever, to talk about representation of those learners in our classrooms, both those for language and for cultural studies and area studies program related to Russia and our region. To that, I turned to a lot of the theoretical framework coming out of the work done through the World Readiness Standards Project since 1999, really, and the creation in 2015 of a relatively quite, no, I will say very inclusive set of standards in terms of languages being represented of the standards project itself. And very important to say, of course, that ACTR was one of those initial members of the National Standards Collaborative Board dating back to the 1999 project. And indeed, with great pleasure, I make reference to the World Readiness Standards for Language Learning that are Russian specific, a project sponsored heavily by American Council of Teachers of Russian. And under the incredible leadership of Jane Shuffleton, I had the honor of serving together with her and the late Peter Merrill on this project. It's also important, I think, to say a little bit of Itzim Garzimsa, that in 2020, our Russian standards were the first of the world language standards to be released out into the world. So within the standards, I just wanted to make a few references. I know there are definitely some deficits in the standard. We're aware of these. I know some wonderful work coming out fairly soon by Rachel Stauffer and some of her colleagues. We'll talk about things like, and quite legitimately, still, even in the current iteration of our standards in Russian, failure to be even more inclusive with things like religious diversity in our region, in the Russian-speaking region. But some things that just do need to be mentioned because they're kind of sine qua non for talking about equity, in my view. That the standards are very now more than ever learner-centered. That the standard of comparisons and connection very much encourages learners and students to perform their identity by making comparisons with other cultures and making connections with other disciplines. Very notably, the cultures standard, along with the communities standard, allows learners to see themselves in the regions in which the language is being used. And that includes regions of diasporic Russian use here in the United States, such as, of course, Brighton Beach, but also Los Angeles, the greater New York area, Chicago, even here in Texas. Houston, and now Austin, with our more than 2 million population, has a very substantial Russian-speaking population in it. And finally, the communication standard, the one that probably has so much import in our courses and their relevance to our learners across disciplines requires or asks us all, I should say, to create welcoming and inclusive learning environments as we proceed in our classrooms. Research in the field at large, and I turn to a relatively recent from 2017. There's been, of course, even more recent work done, but I love the way this particular work by Randolph and Johnson in 2017 comments specifically on the standards and inclusion. As language and culture and community are inextricably connected, the language education classroom provides the ideal context for entering critical, transformative, as Ben Rifkin reminded us, spaces of culture and community study informed by a social justice framework. This critical approach to language study complements the curricular goals as outlined by the World Readiness Standards of 2015, Russian language standards of 2020, and supports the development of students' language proficiency and intercultural competence at all levels. I really am very pleased with the way that talks about. So let me, in my remaining time, talk about these two efforts locally at the University of Texas that I initiated to address diverse learners. One, Russian through global debate, and then a second one actually begun more further back along, called Marginal Masculinities in Russian and Mexican Cultures. The first one, called Advanced Russian, that was being offered as Russian through Global Debate, fourth-year level Russian course, entry-level, threshold, advanced, and hopefully that in the course of this course, with a number of other courses we offer at this same level, we try to bring students very center into the advanced level of proficiency. Was one of its primary goals was to represent intersectional identities in Russia via the use of debate of current topics and current events, both in the world that most of our learners were more familiar with, that was the US sphere, and also what was going on in Russia. I pulled a page from the syllabus, which is kind of a thematic overview rather than the detailed day-to-day offerings, just to give you a kind of at a quick glance an idea of what's going on in these courses. We use the basic text. Tony Brown and Jennifer Bones, just wonderful work of mastering Russian through global debate. The topics in this textbook, and thus those I pulled out for my own thematic use, are wonderfully malleable, so that the general thematic of something like intervention can be broadened out to, or maybe narrowed in more to current events of the time. I was, needless to say, I think that topic literally was the topic of our debate conversation back in February of 2022. And needless to say, the entire both timbre of the course and the thematic of the debate topic itself moved very much specifically into our current events at that particular time. What I like about both using the textbook for the general overview gives students something to hold on to both for homework, not just for homework, but for a kind of grounding of the course in something that they can take with them between class and home, and also then does frame out our topics in class very nicely. A bit of numeric data, just because I think all of us like to see some numbers sometimes about this. Very simply, in terms of learners enrolled, that speaks not just to the increase of numbers in the class, because actually my global debate class, I like it to stay rather intimate, with usually fewer than 20 learners in it, so that the debates can be both very intensive and the field of instruction can be intensive as well. So it's not that our overall numbers in this course have gone up substantially, but look from 2020 to 2024. I chose the most recent 4 iterations of this course to show how the makeup, in particular the ethnic identities of my learners in this class have shifted from the first iteration, where we don't have a high representation of African American learners in Russian studies. We're working very hard to try to increase that number as well, but our Mexican American numbers are relatively high, and I'm very pleased to say in the last decade are increasing in Russian studies generally and in Russian language study in particular. So starting in 2020, you'll see we had no African American students enrolled, but the vast majority of our students, 13 of them in the group, were white identified. As we move through the years, you can see now that that metric kind of literally shifting as the number of white identified students shifts and the number of Mexican American, Latinx identified students increases, and continuing on to 2023 and even a bit further in 2024. We even had the small numbers, 1 in 2 students, African American identified, enrolling in the course as well. And while it is not the goal of, nor the whole purpose of trying to pull in get students to identify in increasing numbers with other ethnicities for this course. The fact that we're able to, by hopefully creating environments in which these individuals feel welcome to be in and to be encouraged to express themselves as their own identities in these topics. And therefore, the debate topics, for example, don't simply say, what does one say about A versus B, but rather, what do you say about A versus B? How would you express your own positionality in something like whether education should be more oriented toward professional schools or toward finishing up a bachelor's degree to go on to graduate school, that kind of thing. So this was one, and again, this is the language focus course. The other experiment was actually begun earlier in 2015. This was a course called Mexican and Russian Men in Popular Cultures. More specifically, it was on interrogating marginal masculinities, both in Russia and Mexico, between 1990 and 2020. So I began the course starting in actually 2015 before I carried the syllabus a little further into the 2020s, and give you some, again, the same kind of just general thematic breakdown of looking at hyper-masculine performances, especially in popular culture, everything from films to popular journals, pop music, and how performances of masculinity in Russia and Mexico in some ways paralleled each other between the collapse of the Soviet Union, the collapse of PRI, the ruling party of Mexico for so many decades, into a new generation of Mexican more authoritative governance, the kind of parallel activities of everything from the mafia movement in Russia in the 1990s and the narcotraficantes in Mexico in the same period, looking at films like the Brat films of the early post-Soviet period and the El Mariachi and Desperado movies here in the US, done by one of our own UT graduates. I have to put that in as well as the director of these films. There are just a number of parallel cultural events, very much, again, what the standards encourages us to do to try to get our students engaged in these realms. Again, some numbers for you. This is a bit of a larger enrollment class, but you can see how from 2015, the first iteration, and then I wanted to kind of jettison us quickly into the 2020s here. The class I offered in 2017, I left out a few iterations in the middle to bring us to 2020 when I offered the class, and the most recent iteration in 2024, last year, when actually the number of Latinx or Latina identified individuals in the class overtook and became the majority of learners in the classroom. As my last comments here on this, I'm always reluctant to put any kind of anecdotal or qualitative data that's from surveys done by students that are confidential. I talked to the students involved here with these particular comments. I made sure they were completely anonymized as well, but I wanted just to pull a few of the comments made on course instructor surveys in these courses from Russian Global Debate, and focus specifically, I put in red those comments that go speak to this idea of creating spaces that give students a chance to really not only use their voice about Russia and in Russian, but keep their own identities front and center. Comments like, this course allowed me to evaluate my personal position toward the topics. It allowed me to participate, allowed us to participate as ourselves and function in this environment. This is in the global debate class. gave us a chance, I love this, having a day to work through my own thoughts and feelings regarding current events was incredibly therapeutic. It speaks directly to some of the things I believe that Ben was talking about as well in compassionate instruction, and allowed me to understand more nuance in Russian while expressing the marginal masculinities class, things like being able to have the freedom to focus on what interested us most, to write from my own positionality, to feel safe and comfortable in expressing our opinions and be able to listen to what others had to say, as well as then finally to encourage the engagement of all students in the class. So I said, these are not meant to be templates or models. I continue to have these, I work on and hope these classes are evolving and ideally getting better with each iteration. But I wanted to put them out there for us as we continue our conversations to find safe ways and safe spaces to create places to allow our students, while learning Russian and about Russia, to be themselves. With that, say thank you all so much for your time and attention, and look forward to questions, comments, and discussion.
All right. Well, thank you, Tom, very much for the presentation and for this very meaningful and timely work you do in your class. That's fascinating. Okay, so let's open up the floor for questions. Jane, I think you're first. All right.
Quick before my internet goes out or anything. This is, first of all, thank you all. I knew this was going to be a wonderful session. It was much better than that. It was really fabulous. And I truly appreciate all three presenters' varied but really meaningful presentations. What I have is directed at Ben, and it's more a comment than a question, Ben. When you were talking about compassion and helping those suffering, popped into my mind an incident that has nothing to do with Russian from the mid-1980s when I had to teach a course of Spanish, second year Spanish, hardest class I ever had to teach. One person in it was a sweet, sweet boy known as Dosh. And Dosh had a terrible time trying to learn Spanish, no matter how well he tried. And this was an era when it was before the standards. We were still doing vocabulary quizzes. So I asked a student from AP French, brilliant, brilliant student, if he would possibly consider tutoring Dosh. So I'm going to suggest tutoring as another possibility for students to engage in compassionate, collaborative learning. And this student did in fact work with Dosh, and I gave him some pointers on, how would you help somebody figure out how in the world to just learn vocabulary words. The next quiz, Dosh got a B. He got 8 out of 10. If you had seen the smile on that boy's face when he got, 8 Spanish words correct, man, I mean, it just said everything. It was not that I did a formal session with the other student, the French student, but that would have been the best possible assessment. So again, I would just suggest tutoring as a possible addition of ways to do this. And thank you.
Thank you, Jane. That's a great idea, especially at the upper level classes, to go back to the lower level classes. And one of the things I think it's really important for us to understand as well is that our students come to us with very diverse backgrounds and experiences. Some of them have been trained by previous instructors that they, quote unquote, do not have language learning aptitude. They've had negative experiences learning either Russian or another language, and they're carrying that with them into our course. And the other thing for us to bear in mind is that not all of our students have the same kind of motivations that we have, or we had, or we think we had. And I just think about the times when I've been in, well, let me compare something completely different. I'm learning Spanish now. My university is an Hispanic serving institution. We have a lot of Spanish-speaking students, and their family members have a range of command of English. So for me to be able to interact with their family members when they come to campus is important to me as a leader on our campus. So I'm learning Spanish. But I'm not learning Spanish with the same motivation that I had for learning Russian. I have absolutely no intention of being a professor of Spanish. I have no intention of working in a Spanish-speaking country. I have no intention of being a spy in a Spanish-speaking country. So all of those things inform my approach to learning Spanish, which I think makes it more similar to the ways in which many of my students are studying Russian. And let me tell you something. When I make a mistake in speaking Spanish and I'm talking with the mom or the dad or the grandparent of one of my current students, not one of them has ever said to me, "You just used ser instead of estar, and therefore I will no longer speak with you," right? And so I'm just trying to learn how to communicate successfully. And I think that that's something for us to bear in mind about our students because our own motivations, what has driven us, some of us are native speakers of Russian, living and working here in the United States. So our motivation to speak English well is really high because we're not always in contexts where there are Russian speakers around us. And then for those of us who are native speakers of English, we teach Russian. So that's a very high motivation. So just bearing in mind that our students are different is so, so important for how we go about the business of teaching. So thank you, Jane.
Do we have any other questions? There you go, Valentina. If you could unmute yourself, I don't think we can hear you.
I wanted to thank for the wonderful session, yes, and the wonderful presentations that that were presented today. My comments are about Olga's presentation. Thank you very much, because we know that stand-up humor is difficult to comprehend, to understand, sometimes even by the native speakers. But you managed to demonstrate that if carefully selected and if carefully thought out, this material can work in the classroom. So I just wanted to ask if you ever tried to use Maxim Galkin's performance, because we know that he's not only a wonderful humorist, but also a very good parodist. Yeah. And besides, among the younger ones, there's also Ivan Urgant, and I liked his interviews with kids. That could be an excellent teaching material as well, if carefully selected, yes. And I would also recommend Valery Zhitkov. He has a nice monologue about Russian fairy tales, very funny one, yes. So, but just wanted to ask if you ever tried Maxim Galkin. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that question. Urgant, I guess I don't consider him a comedian per se. He's more of a, well, I guess sort of more compared to him to
It's
call
spontaneous. It's anyway, humor is spontaneous anyway.
And he has some really fascinating episodes from his show that I can see where they could easily be incorporated into a classroom. He, in fact, hosted some of these comedians on his show as well. And kind of this nice little banter between him and Komisarenko, for example, is kind of a nice thing to use it. But so absolutely, I have not used that myself. Again, I kind of like shorts personally because they're very compact texts and they could be brought into, well, any classroom really, right? You could spend 2 minutes on it, right? And it's good. It's kind of this quick introduction. But I can see where it could be very useful.
Yeah, well, yes, and they really liked him, yes.
I love very much as well. He has a lot of parody texts that I think, I'd have to actually really sift through his stuff. I have not used any of his stuff in the classroom. I think I've watched quite a bit of his stuff, right? But a lot of it is parodying other pop performers. And I think that requires the kind of knowledge that our students simply will not have. They will not know who... I don't know. Oh gosh, what's her name? Ветер с моря дул. Natalia. Yeah, okay. See, I can't remember the name of the singer right at this point. So he's referencing a lot of pop icons from the 80s and 90s, right? And a lot of his monologues actually do tap back into like Zykina, Ludmila Zykina, right? I mean, that he's very good at parodying her. He's done some Putin impersonations as well. So his impersonation work, I think, is fascinating. I just wonder if it'll just kind of go over our students' heads. The scaffolding that'll have to go into that, I think, is going to be possibly more than the language class really needs. But you know, I think again, the beauty of using comedy in any classroom, it really goes to the creativity of an instructor, the needs of that particular classroom. And I think the possibilities are endless, right? You can go from anecdote that Ben mentioned earlier to, you know, a stand-up routine to, you know, someone like Galkin. I have never heard of Zhitkov. I took the name down. I'll have to look.
You can find him on YouTube, yes.
Yes.
I like specifically this one about Russian fairy tales. It's pretty funny.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you for your question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. But thank you all the presenters today. Yes, thank you very much.
Dan.
I just want to join the others in saluting the work of the ACTR team over the many years of developing and maintaining and updating and upgrading the standards. This has been a huge job, and the two living members of that committee, Tom Garza and Jane Shuffleton, are both on this panel. And I just wanted to stress how very, very important that work was and is. I've referenced the standards, including the intercultural standard, which in my view was unbelievably late in appearing, and it's so good that it's in fact the Russian field that led the parade on that one with some very, very good practice and really good examples. So thank you, Olga, for convening this panel, and thanks very much. Personal thanks to Tommy and Jane for their unfailing support and dedication to maintaining the standards. It means a lot to the field and to the position of Russian in our field today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dan. That's important. Karen.
Thank you all very much for fascinating and really inspiring presentations. So I really, really appreciate it. Oh, Olga, I just want to say that I've taken notes, and I'm not educated enough to ask you good questions, but I'm going to keep looking at more videos and look for ways to incorporate this in my teaching. I know that we have a course in Polish comedy, my colleague who's here in this group teaches a course on Russian satire and Will in the Fall. So I'm looking forward to exploring the materials you presented to us further. Thank you. Ben, I am on an assessment committee right now at our university. We're developing new learning objectives for the general education curriculum. And I can't talk about it too much because they haven't been passed yet, but one of the interesting discussions that we've been having are discussions of how to assess things like humility, approaching topics with humility. The word humility appears in these drafts, and how to assess mutual respect, which is in there as well. So I'm love to hear from you more about ways in which we can be assessing those things in our students' work and overall in assessing those aspects of general education curriculum.
Karen, thanks for that really interesting and important question. I'm going to give you an answer which I hope will be meaningful, even though it won't be simple.
Yeah.
I think when we think about how we assess student work, we need to recognize that for centuries, perhaps millennia, assessment has been driven by the convenience of the instructor.
Yeah.
So what is the easiest thing to assess? And that's how I'm going to assess it, right? And so what we need to do is recognize that the things that you're talking about assessing are, number one, really important, far more important than lots of things that are easy to assess, and that we shouldn't turn away from assessing it because it's hard. And that's what people have done, right? That's what people have done, including, by the way, talking about the assessment of teaching. And, one of the reasons that we are stuck in some difficult times in higher education is because it's easier to say how many publications someone has than it is to say they're great in the classroom and here's why.
Definitely.
So that being said, one of the ways that you can begin the process of constructing a method of assessing some of these really important concepts is to ask students to write a reflection about their experience with this issue and come up with some ways to assess on the basis of first analyzing what the students are saying. So if we think about how the proficiency guidelines were actually developed, the scholars started eliciting speech samples and listening to them and trying to group them into groups of, well, these people are performing not as well as those. And what are the characteristics that we're seeing in lots of different right? You see how and ultimately, oh, okay, these people, they're speaking in paragraphs. I'm just guessing that that's not something that was top of the top of the impression first off the bat. Let's see who speaks in paragraphs before they started listening, right? But rather listening to the data and having that drive what are the creation of the benchmarks. And so the discomfort in this is that you're setting yourselves up for a process that doesn't immediately have answers, right? But it's honest and it gets you to a better place where you can be reliable and consistent. And letting the students drive it with their actual output, I think, is really the most important thing. And so having them reflect. And part of this also has a wonderful washback effect, is because if faculty know that they have to assess student learning outcomes on these criteria, then they're going to embed in their courses tasks in which students demonstrate growth on those criteria.
Yeah.
And if we think about where we were as a profession 30, 40 years ago, and grading on the basis of conjugation and declension errors versus communication, well, it's with the development of the proficiency guidelines and the rise of the concept that your student might want to get a job with the federal government for which they'll have an OPI that begins to inform the textbooks, the curricula, the at-seal presentations, everything. And so Wisconsin could be a leader in having this kind of assessment process. So I hope that's helpful.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Yeah, definitely student reflections have been in the discussion. Thank you. Thank you. I hope there'll be more information on this in the next couple of years. Thank you. And Tom, I have a question for you and about your students. Both courses sound fascinating. I'm particularly interested in the masculinities course because that's further from my expertise. Not that I'm any expert at all on debate. I'm not, but I'm curious about what the students say about their motivations for taking the course, and whether those motivations vary according to their gender identity.
Thank you so much for that, Karen. I think that is a very important part, actually, is if those of you out there are interested in constructing similar or other relevant courses that would do the kinds of things and try to get the kind of inclusion that this course seems to be doing at University of Texas. So I do always ask that question, actually, regardless, before I was even really thinking a lot about gender, identity, inclusion, equity in my classroom at all, say 15, 20 years ago, as much as I wish I had been. And the kind of, so one quick thing is that I cross-list this course with, or it has been cross-listed with, women and gender studies, Mexican American, Latino, Latina studies. It has flags on it. Comparative literature, I forgot to include that. Comparative literature, and has so-called flags or divisional breadth requirements of global cultures and independent inquiry attached to it. And so the reason students tend to take it is either an immediate identification with the subject matter. So Latinx students saying, we don't get courses on Mexican identity really, and certainly none that are in any kind of comparative context. So I was interested. Some students who are either in Russian studies or themselves identified as Russian heritage speakers or even native speakers, I get in the class as well. And then I do get a large number of students who come in from women and gender studies or from ethnic studies, just interested in the mode of inquiry, comparative ethnic studies. And that's the kind of, if you will, it's not so much a hook, but I guess that's one of the motivational factors that gets them in because it's an elective course. There's nothing required about it whatsoever to get numbers in. And then I think the subject matter usually is surprising to them. Even if they're identified with one or the other groups, they find seeing sort of like this movement, for my Mexican students, the Stiliaga movement, having so much in common with the Zoot Suit and Pachuco movements in Mexican culture. And then the stories begin to fly in class, and I love the way the Russian students will start talking about things like, well, we've got this film, and of course we show the film bits and pieces from Stiliagi, but then we also show documentary footage as far back as from the 1950s. Really, it has to be Khrushchev when we finally get filmed versions of Stiliagi in Moscow and Leningrad, and then our students will talk about contemporary dances or events that they're going to where they're dressed as their parents in those exact same type of outfits and all. So that's the kind of thing we hope to get going in the class. Yeah.
It's fascinating. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Jane, I see a hint. I don't know if they'll ask us to leave this room. I think we're supposed to end at 1:30 or 2:30, but let's take another question. Jane, they're not kicking us out.
It's a quick one for Tom. Following up on that, Tom, do you have any data on the gender enrollment in that course?
I do. Thank you for asking that. I've tried so hard now to keep much more active data. It's been historically for that course almost to the number 50-50, at least for male identified, female identified.
Yeah.
I have an increasing number, and this partly is just Gen Z numbers that are now at their peak in our courses, a number of non-binary students every year. The 2024 iteration, I want to say the number was up to about 9 students out of the 42, I think, enrolled in the course. So 9 of the students were identified as non-binary in the class.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's great.
Right. Anything else? Any other questions? Anything? No? All right. Well, thank you very much to all the presenters. Thank you to everybody for this fantastic conversation that we've had. It's been a really, really wonderful session. Thank you all.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Bye.
And I will stop the recording.